A major financial scandal has erupted in Xi'an, China. A government-affiliated bond service provider, Xi'an Jingwei Treasury Bonds, has defaulted on large volumes of national bonds. The failure to honor these bonds has sparked widespread panic among investors. Hundreds of affected investors have taken to the streets, staging protests outside government buildings in a desperate attempt to reclaim their funds. In this video, elderly investors are seen breaking down in tears upon learning their life savings have vanished. The Xi'an Jingwei Treasury Bond Service Department is a financial unit approved by the Financial Bureau. It has been operating here for 36 years. Now, thousands of Xi'an residents have bought treasury bonds and face losing all their money. When I filmed this protest, I was threatened by plainclothes officers. The Xi'an Jingwei Treasury Bond Service Department was established in 1996 under China's Ministry of Finance. On February 14, 2025, its chief executive went missing, and by March 24th, the bond payouts began to fail. Authorities have yet to explain where the funds have gone. On March 31st, hundreds of investors gathered outside the Xi'an municipal government offices demanding a meeting with the mayor. The protest was met with heavy police presence and allegations of excessive force. After the crowd was dispersed, some demonstrators were seen in tears. Others sat silently along the roadside. Some protesters were arrested, and information about the event was suppressed. On April 1st, the Xi'an Jingwei Bond Service Department was officially shut down. Authorities cited suspicions of criminal activity, stating that a police investigation was underway. Subsequently, on April 3rd, the Beilin branch of the Xi'an Public Security Bureau issued a public notice, instructing affected investors to file police reports at designated locations. By April 11, protests had escalated, with hundreds once again assembling outside the Xi'an municipal government. Protesters carried homemade signs with messages such as "Return our money," "Government betrayal defies moral justice." Chants of "Meet the mayor" and "Give us back our hard-earned money" echoed through the streets. In the crowd were elderly citizens, young mothers carrying children, and middle-aged workers, all demanding Jingwei Treasury bonds to honor the bonds they had purchased. The demonstration was again met with a police crackdown. As protesters were forcibly removed, someone cried out in despair, "We don't even have a place left to cry." In the aftermath of the scandal, Chinese authorities moved swiftly to control the narrative. Online discussions were deleted, and protest footage was removed from major platforms. From May 10th to May 15th, new waves of protests erupted outside the Xi'an Finance Bureau in Beilin District and the municipal government offices. Hundreds of investors once again held marches, demonstrations, and rallies demanding the local government repay the Jingwei bond funds. Among them were gravely ill pensioners hoping to use their investments for medical treatment and deeply in-debt individuals needing to repay loans. Despite these pleas, the local finance bureau denied responsibility, instead reclassifying the bond sales as illegal fundraising. Faced with thousands of victims, the local government's initial response was not to pursue accountability, but to focus on maintaining order. One such investor, Chen Yang, shared his story with international media on May 16th. He said he had invested 700,000 yuan, equivalent to approximately $97,000 US, his entire life saving, into what he believed were secure government-backed bonds. Now, he says, it's all gone. We're all trapped here, and it's almost impossible for information to get out. The police have even begun using violence against us, so things are very difficult for us. Since the crisis broke out on March 25th, the government has offered no explanation. We're starting to feel like we're losing our minds. After the Jingwei Treasury bonds collapsed in Xi'an, Chinese authorities have shown heightened sensitivity toward protests by citizens facing financial distress. Authorities have adopted an increasingly hardline stance on protest activity. Demonstrators report that protesters were being arrested. One lawyer who publicly advocated for the victims was detained and went on a hunger strike before being released after 5 days. The Xi'an Public Security Bureau's Beilin branch released an announcement that investors could file police reports, and many did. However, victims claimed their personal information, including names, phone numbers, and ID numbers, was recorded by the Chang'an Road Police Station and was later used to monitor the individuals. One victim, using the pseudonym Li Chao Chao, invested 100,000 yuan, equivalent to approximately $14,000 US, in bonds when recommended by a friend in 2023. The money was intended to cover her grandson's school fees. Li told reporters that on May 15th, the number of victims protesting had grown compared to previous gatherings, with a heavy police presence at the scene. She described the staff at the National Public Complaints and Proposals Administration in Xi'an as mere figureheads, saying they kept repeating the same lines: "Don't cause trouble, go home and wait, the police are already involved, so don't worry. Lee also expressed that many victims invested their life savings, some even pooling money accumulated over several generations. Some residents in urban villages sold 5 or 6 property, while others who received demolition compensation poured all their funds into these investments. The largest individual investment reportedly reached tens of millions of yuan. Among the victims are also corrupt officials who fear coming forward or filing complaints, so the total amount they invested remains unknown. One case involved a man in his 90s who had collected scraps for years to save 190,000 yuan, all of which he invested in bonds. With his life savings gone, he now begs for food outside the National Public Complaints and Proposals Administration. Authorities reportedly gave him 200 yuan as a handout. Lee said they were all suffering terribly. Another investor, Feng Yan, put in 400,000 yuan, equivalent to about 55,000 US dollars. She said she worked as a mall shopping guide and ran street stalls. It took her 20 years of frugal living to save this money. She believed government bonds were safer than bank deposits. For many investors like her, these funds were their retirement savings and emergency funds. The so-called state-backed treasury bonds promoted by Xi'an Jingwei have effectively become scraps of paper. The question now is, where did the money go? Did it end up lining the pockets of certain high-ranking officials, or was it used by the local government to cover other financial black holes? Investors allege that funds from Jingwei's treasury bonds accounts had already been secretly transferred long before the crisis erupted. An insider revealed obvious abnormal cash flows. Regulatory data shows that only 30% of the raised capital was actually used to purchase treasury bonds. The remaining cash was funneled into a web of related companies, with part of it used to pay interest to earlier investors, an arrangement typical of a Ponzi scheme. When new deposits slowed, the entire structure collapsed. These investors, who trusted in the credibility of the state, were unaware their funds had been misused. When they took out to the streets to demand accountability, they found even their right to protest was suppressed. Another insider revealed that sales staff at Xi'an Jingwei Treasury Bonds carried multiple company ID badges. Depending on the customer's inquiries, they would switch identities and claim to be working on behalf of different companies. When questioned by regulators, they dismissed responsibility, saying they were merely third-party distributors. Government bonds are widely viewed as the safest investment in China, an emblem of national credit. The Jingwei Treasury bonds default has therefore undermined public faith in the government's financial guarantees. If even treasury bonds can fail, many ask, what investment is truly safe? Victims say the Jingwei Treasury Bond Service Center was formally approved by the Xi'an Financial Bureau, and its registration was submitted to both the Shanxi Provincial Department of Finance and the Ministry of Finance. The operating entity, originally the Xi'an Textile Group Corporation, now part of the Xi'an Industrial Investment Group, briefly struggled with payouts in May 2003. Government intervention resolved that crisis in about 40 days. Since then, the department has maintained normal operations. In December 1999, the Shanxi provincial government issued an order to consolidate and regulate treasury bond intermediaries. Out of 14 similar institutions under the Xi'an Finance Bureau, 13 were dissolved. Jingwei alone was allowed to stay open, retaining the same address, signage, staff, phone numbers, and regulatory jurisdictions for nearly 3 decades. At the moment of this year's collapse, the office was still operating legally. Activists estimate 6,000 or 7,000 people bought Jingwei treasury bonds. Most were aged between 60 and 80. Each investor often represents savings from 2 or 3 generations, meaning tens of thousands are incredibly affected. Broadly, victims fall into 4 groups. First, the displaced residents of urban villages in Xi'an. Second, enterprise retirees who held dual positions. Third, migrant workers from nearby county. And fourth, local middle-aged Xi'an residents, as well as investors from Beijing, Shanghai, and even overseas. Many of these investors have been buying bonds from Jingwei regularly for almost 30 years. The Jingwei scandal is not an isolated case. China's financial sector has seen a raft of defaults and fraud in recent years. For example, Cedar International Trust, formerly Jiangxi International Trust, is a non-banking financial institution approved by China Banking Regulatory Commission. It was ranked in the Fortune Global 500 for 4 straight years until 2021. But in January 2022, its founder, Zhang Jin, issued a public apology announcing that the company could not meet its redemption obligations on time for January due to various factors. Around 8,000 investors were affected, with total losses exceeding 20 billion yuan, equivalent to about $2.8 $8 billion. In April 2022, 4 rural banks in Henan province abruptly froze online withdrawals and transfers without warning. Tens of thousands of depositors could not withdraw from their accounts. The incident triggered widespread panic and mass protests. Authorities responded with harsh crackdowns. Some protesters were detained. After continued demonstrations, many victims reported being followed, harassed, and surrounded by police. According to the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission, the case originated from collusion between internal and external shareholders of the bank. Over 40 billion yuan in deposits were affected, impacting more than 400,000 people. To this day, countless depositors in Henan province have still not recovered their savings. More than 3 years have passed since the crisis began, yet the Henan government has failed to offer a viable resolution. Instead of taking accountabilities, authorities have weaponized state power, harassing, intimidating, and threatening victims in an apparent attempt to pressure them into abandoning their legal claims. In November 2023, China's largest asset management firm, Zhongzhi Enterprise Group, collapsed without warning. The company admitted it was deeply insolvent and faced serious operational risks. Its available resources fell drastically short of covering its debts, which exceeded 220 billion yuan. Over 150,000 high net worth investors were affected, with individual investments starting at 3 million yuan and the highest reaching over 5 billion. Because the collapse of Zhongzhi Group mainly affected high net worth individuals, some cynically commented online that Zhongzhi had perfected the art of defrauding the rich. 1 month later, in December 2023, the wealth management platform Haiyin Wealth also collapsed without notice. Investigations revealed that all 465 of its financial services were illegal. The underlying investment assets were entirely fabricated. Haiyin Wealth had set up 22 shell companies to funnel money from 46,000 investors into a massive fund pool. The company then used a fake exchange to register these assets. Thus, 71.6 billion yuan vanished without a trace, shaking investor confidence nationwide. In October 2024, depositors in Nehe City, Heilongjiang Province, discovered their local rural fund mutual aid cooperative had abruptly shut down, and they were unable to withdraw funds. When customers arrived, the office was locked and calls went unanswered. Victims reported that the cooperative's management had fled with the money, leaving tens of thousands, mostly elderly rural residents, destitute. The fallout affected an estimated 400,000 depositors, with losses totaling nearly 40 billion yuan. The incident sparked mass protests, which authorities swiftly suppressed. Some depositors who repeatedly took part in protests were later followed, monitored, or obstructed by the police. Though some Chinese media initially covered the story, authorities later suppressed the information. In March 2025, a financial fraud scandal erupted involving Jiang Haihui Group in Shandong Province, with losses reaching 28 billion yuan. The company, which operated under government backing for 15 years, promised investors high returns on what it claimed were legitimate projects. After the scheme unraveled, company chairman An Zhibin and his wife Zhou Chunwei reportedly fled to the United States. With no alternative, victims pleaded for government intervention to recover their stolen funds and hold the perpetrators accountable for contractual fraud. Meanwhile, China's peer-to-peer (P2P) lending industry has virtually collapsed after years of widespread defaults. Once a booming sector, it spiraled out of control due to poor regulation and rampant fraud. By 2018, China's Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission brought P2P under supervision. In 2019, 9 provinces had already begun shutting down local platforms. By November 2020, the number of active P2P firms officially dropped to 0. Yet as of mid-2020, more than 800 billion yuan in investor fraud remained unrecovered, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin and countless victims, while the government offered little resolution. China's economic growth has long relied on debt-driven expansion. As of late 2024, central government bonds stood at 34.6 trillion yuan, with local general debt at 16.7 trillion and special purpose debt at 30.8 trillion. Additionally, off-the-books hidden debt from local governments is estimated by the International Monetary Funds to exceed 60 trillion yuan. Due to the lack of transparency in hidden debt data, the risks are significantly higher. The Chinese government continued practice of borrowing new debt to repay old debt has caused its debt burden to snowball. According to the Bank for International Settlements, China's non-financial sector debt has now surpassed 300% of GDP, far higher than most developed economies. The collapse of China's real estate bubble has only worsened the situation. For over a decade, the property sector was viewed as the engine of economic growth, but over-reliance on housing led to massive local government debt and a surge in bad loans. As the market slowed, fiscal gaps widened. In 2024, some regions even postponed repayment on special purpose bonds, raising fears of deeper financial instability. Chinese economist Cheng Xiaonong expressed his viewpoint on the government's systemic misuse of banking funds. According to Cheng, major state-owned banks have long been forced to bleed cash to support monopolistic industrial conglomerates, which local commercial banks are bleeding cash to local government. These established behaviors have turned local governments and state-run firms into super debtors with no fear of default. When one bond matures, another is issued, often for a larger amount, with state-controlled banks forced to buy in. This endless debt spiral drains depositors' savings into the state's reserves, never to be returned. The larger the bank, the greater the volume of toxic assets it carries. These bad debts now remain on the books, and the banks simply do not have the capacity to offset them with asset impairment reserves because the amount of bad debt reaches into the hundreds of trillions. The convergence of long-standing financial risks, widespread corruption, macroeconomic volatility, and a worsening global environment is pushing China closer to a full-scale financial crisis. One online user asked, if rural banks collapse, wealth management funds default, and even government bonds aren't safe, what can ordinary people still trust? But perhaps the most concerning part is what this crisis reveals. Not just a financial system in decay, but the crumbling foundation of China's entire political and economic structure. What once appeared to be a story of prosperity now stands exposed as a fragile facade, built on corruption, deception, and centralized control, slowly collapsing under its own weight.